Bye-bye. In the last 3 years, more statues have been toppled, removed, or defaced since possibly the end of the Cold War. And as campaign season heats up, it's a recurring fixation for the president.
Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, and indoctrinate our children. I am signing an executive order to establish the National Guard of American Heroes.
While the president's face etched in granite may not be likely, his recent executive order shows the developer-in-chief has no small plans for leaving behind a monumental legacy that is substantial, permanent, and one-sided. The order's proposed National Garden of American Heroes, replete with suggestions for statuary dedicated to Antonin Scalia, Billy Graham, and Daniel Boone, offers a uniquely blinkered view into the American past. But for a growing chorus of dissenting voices, Trump's latest initiative is a unique opportunity to reimagine the very idea of monuments and cultural memory.
The executive order came out in a moment where we were looking at and talking about uprisings across the country.
It was missing a really clear statement on the condition of a country in this moment. Our monuments are not just symbols. Monuments are statements of power and presence in public.
The time when we learn most about the people in monuments is when we take them down, because they're only teaching one lesson when they're up on a pedestal. They're teaching who belongs here and who doesn't. But when we remove them, we interrogate the person, the people, the situation, the context.
Farber and Mobley's work with Monument Lab and Paper Monuments offer a radical re-envisioning of the monumental impulse and can be seen in a variety of eclectic projects across the world. We asked them to apply their perspective on truly democratic monument building to President Trump's executive order.
Section 1, Purpose. To unearth the next generation of monuments based on a full reckoning with American history.
We've never had a full reckoning with our history. Whether we're thinking about stolen native lands, broken treaties, enslavement, these are not just issues from the past.
We're talking about a legacy of writing history, telling history, placing it in the public square that had political intent behind it, that had a substantial effort made by the Klan, made by the Daughters of the Confederacy, to create understandings of history that are limited, that eliminate people like me, that eliminate an increasingly large portion of our country from our shared history.
The past isn't so separate from us. It compounds and it corresponds to the current moment. And that is the material that we can think about that is monumental, which is learning from the past and understanding and evolving with it. Section 6, Permanence. Monuments look like they're permanent. Monuments have an aura of permanence, but no monument is permanent. No civic institution is permanent. We have to invest in them. We have to tend to them. And we have to decide how we evolve with the ideas. Permanence is a fantasy. Permanence is a way to actually put your head in the sand and just assume that progress is going to happen without you doing the work.
Section 7, Definition. The term historically significant American includes citizens and non-citizens who have lost lives and land through state violence, as well as those who have upheld traditions of resistance and dissent. When we talk about historical significance, we are generally speaking of valorized individuals. It's very rarely vested in the collective. It's very rarely vested in the event on which time turns, on which history shifts. Those events are shaped by hundreds and thousands who don't get memorialized, who don't get monuments, who often don't get mentioned in a history book. History doesn't fit well in statues. Movements don't fit well in summaries. They're ongoing and they feed each other. The civil rights movement was strong because the labor movement was strong, and you can't detach things from one another. But that's often what we're doing when we're talking about monuments. And it's certainly often what we're doing when we're talking about historically significant Americans. We're detaching people from their contexts, from their communities, from the people who upheld them in a movement or who pushed them down for them to push back against. We're erasing the background that led someone to have the power to be a great man of history. And in erasing that, we miss the opportunity to be honest about not just our history, but about ourselves. And we should do better.
Section 2, Task Force for Building and Reimagining Monuments. The task force shall be led by artists, activists, scholars, and young people. Every time you see a headline about a monument coming down or being toppled, just know that there is years, if not decades, of activism, of art making, of activity and conversation that went behind that one municipal act. And so we want to be led in this new process for monuments from the very people who have been prophetic. They've seen that we can evolve with our monuments and we can think about new symbols and new systems.
If we think of monuments as being the markers of our political values, of our policies, of the world that we lay claim to, then who has a greater right to shape the world that we want to see in the future than the people who will live in it? Section 3, Garden of Monuments. The garden will include works by contemporary artists that elevate the power of creativity over violence and oppression. Plans for the garden must respond to the catastrophic loss of life in the COVID-19 pandemic and to centuries of systemic racism. And obviously, those two factors are deeply intertwined, as our disparate impact numbers tell us as we look at a rising death toll.
Any discussion about monuments today must take into account grief, loss, and challenge that we face. How we respond to these dual pandemics may be a path forward where we can think about the creative visions necessary to make room for our grief and to make room for transformation and growth. Section 4, Commissioning of New Statues and Works of Art. The task force shall support Black, Indigenous, and other artists of color through radically increased funding for the NEA, NEH, and local public art and history agencies.
We want to see a level of investment in arts and history that rivals the New Deal.
We want to see support and investment in artistic and educational agencies from the federal level down to the local.
We need another federal arts project, a federal writers project, a federal history project, because we know that so much of what we understand about the diversity of our country's history does come from those projects.
But we also want to reimagine them and understand how historically white artists and historians have benefited.
Section 5, Educational Programming, shall prioritize the allocation of funding to programs and projects that educate Americans from pre-K through college, along with providing universal health care, affordable housing, and the environmental justice necessary for thriving communities. In this moment where we're talking about schools reopening or not, when we're having to reckon with what it means to have 20% of children in my city not have access to the internet to be able to learn virtually, the choice has really never been this stark, at least not since the end of Reconstruction. And certainly the stakes have never been higher. We can either double down on economic insecurity that gets weaponized through racial hatred, or we can reckon honestly with the costs of our history and invest in a future worth having. We can make whole communities, or we can run it off a cliff. That's it. Those are the only things on the table.
Section 8, General Provisions. Reallocate funds away from state violence and toward a commitment to monumental justice, education, and care for the people this government is meant to serve. How we invest our resources is not an abstract thing. In the city of Philadelphia, where we're based, the overtime for police pay in the first weekend of the uprisings would have supported the Public Art Office for 4 years. We believe that the greatest pathways toward healing, toward connection, toward uplift exist in communities already. People have had to make a lot from a little.
I think some of the most monumental thinking that we're seeing is about the reallocation of funds. It's looking at a defense budget of $740 billion, $100 billion in policing, $80 billion in incarceration, and envisioning what it looks like to invest that in housing, in education, in healthcare, in preparing for climate change. We talk a lot, often cavalierly, about budgets as moral documents, but that is precisely what they are. And the choice to allocate funds to state violence at home and abroad is just that, it's a choice. And we can make different choices. We have a generation of people, we have the largest interracial movement in this country demanding that we make that choice. We should listen.